My name is Peter Miller, and I'm the Dean. And on behalf of the Director, Susan Weber, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight to this very interesting, fun event, What is Active Matter? Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathering tonight on the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape people. We're here with Active Matter to launch the second phase of what will turn out to be a 10-year project, generously supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, entitled Cultures of Conservation. So just to give you very briefly a kind of running start in the direction of tonight's event, Cultures of Conservation has at its core the idea that the conversation between humanists interested in the study of the human past through its material remains, and conservators, conservation scientists, and material scientists who work on objects in a context where they are able to bring an extraordinary range of technical analysis to bear on objects, but aren't necessarily engaged with the range of questions that the humanists are engaged with in a different part of the ecosystem. And so what Cultures of Conservation is about is bringing together the humanists asking a range of questions and the conservators and conservation scientists able to deploy a range of tools to give answers to questions. And it's in that bringing together that we hope to not only improve the answers and give answers to questions that we have, but actually, and I think more importantly, to improve the quality of our questions, which is really the main core of what we might think humanistic inquiry to be. So the first phase of the project, 5 years, has happily come and gone with public events. Many of you, I think, have been to some of them. We've done exhibitions, we've had conferences, we've had many talks, evenings, and lunches. We've had postdoctoral fellows come and go off to permanent positions in other parts of the country and the world. And we're now embarked, happily and gratefully, to our friends at the Mellon Foundation, upon the second phase of the project, which in some sense is even more elaborate than the first phase. The first phase was about creating a conversation to really improve and deepen what we here mean when we talk about the cultural history of the material world. Up to 5 years ago, when we talked about the material world, we might have had objects in mind, but we didn't really think about those objects as themselves materially constituted, nor necessarily as amenable to technical analysis as opposed to optical or historical analysis. And so what we're doing in the second phase is actually deepening our knowledge of the material by engaging much more deeply and consistently with the science, with the material science, by having on the faculty a conservation scientist who's joined us, Jennifer Maas, many of you may know, and also in embarking on this particular research project that is formally being launched tonight and tomorrow during the day. And so I'll turn more to that. Tomorrow, for those of you who return, there'll be a fuller discussion in the morning when we begin about the nature of the project as a whole. But tonight, as a kind of teaser for the event that's forthcoming, we're going to focus just on the question of active matter and what it is. Active matter as a term emerges in the 1990s. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project, which led to driverless cars, did a project in 2007 on programmable matter. So that's part of the push here. Some of you, avid readers of the New York Times during the dog days of the summer, may have seen an article on how scientists at Harvard have turned bacteria into storage devices. We've used that on our posters because it's another example of what we're talking about. So the push has come from material scientists who've been inspired by natural materials, natural structures, natural procedures, and in imitating those have looked for ways to make new kinds of materials, synthetic design. There are a range of terms that have been used. And yet, active matter, while specific, it belongs on the spectrum with a variety of approaches that all reflect an attempt to, in a sense, to break through or alter the hierarchical relationship between subject and object, between matter that is viewed as passive or servile, and intellect, soul, activity that is viewed as generative and guiding. And so whether we're talking about something like nonlinearity, which is one way of thinking about this, or active matter, or making and knowing, it's a moment in time where there is a kind of convergence of these approaches to breaking down these dualisms. And many of you may know other terms or may yourselves supply other terms to talk about this. So that's one context. There's another context for this, which in the art world has been going on since the 1960s in Fluxus, the making of art in ways that it's designed to change, to move, to adapt. In the history of art, objects have always changed, and conservators and collectors have often been hard-pressed to contain them and constrain them for changing. So one of the things that's happening in our time is that activity is now the premise, not the thing to be banned, not the trouble, but the thing sought out. And so active matter comes at us from different locations. In philosophy, the question of the ghost in the machine, the soul in the body, is an old one and is in itself analogous to the problem of the passive, servile, and the active. So these are all, in a sense, the background for what we're talking about. And as you can hear just from the possible ways in which this re-altering of the rebalancing of the intellectual landscape suggests, the world of active matter is also one which is of necessity interdisciplinary, because the conventional hierarchies, the conventional slicing up of bodies of knowledge no longer work when this fundamental notion of what is active and what is passive is put to a side. And so for us here at the Bard Graduate Center, with our multidisciplinary convergence on problems, starting from the questions, not from the answers, not from the disciplinary divisions, active matter is a kind of natural fit for our own kind of intellectual approach to things. And of course, what we're looking for, to let the cat out of the bag, ultimately in this project is we're looking to help think with conservators and conservation scientists about what it means to preserve and conserve knowledge in a time and a place where knowledge is meant to be constantly active and mobile. So with that, I am going to stop my part of this, which is just, as I say, a teaser, and turn the podium over to the person who will introduce tonight's speakers, and that is Jessica Walther, who is currently Objects Conservator at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. She's trained as a conservator, the BA in Art History and Biology from Williams College, and then a degree from the Institute of Fine Arts Conservation Center. She's worked professionally at the Brooklyn Museum, the Frick, the American Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We've been very fortunate in having her here as a postdoctoral fellow in our own Cultures of Conservation project over these last couple of years. She's worked archaeologically in the field in Peru, in Sicily, in Sardis. She's done projects for the World Monuments Fund, for the Crest Foundation, for the Seneca Village Archaeological Project. And just to give you a sense of some of her recently peer-reviewed publications, 2016, Reduced, Reused, and Recycled, the Treatment and Redisplay of a Repurposed 17th Century Coromandel Lacquer Screen in the Acton Collection at Villa La Pietra in Florence. And 2017, Collaboratively Thinking Forward 3D Data in Conservation and Archaeology. So it is to Jessica Walther that I hand over the podium, and I wish you all a stimulating evening and day tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Peter. First, a quick thank you to Peter, Bard Graduate Center, and the American Museum of Natural History's Conservation Department for hosting my fellowship last year, and to all the faculty here for being such supportive and engaging colleagues. I can't speak highly enough of the fellowship program here at BGC, and I'm so glad to remain involved as adjunct faculty this year. Tonight, we'll have remarks from 3 distinguished speakers, followed by a moderated discussion at the end of their 3 talks, which will be led by Dr. Alicia Boswell, postdoctoral Cultures of Conservation Fellow here at Bard Graduate Center and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. First, I'll read all of the speakers' introductions, and then they'll speak. I'll ask you to please hold your questions for the end. For those of you live streaming the event at BGC TV, you can tweet your questions to us at Bard Grad Center TV. Tonight, we're very delighted to welcome Admir Mashik, Glenn Wharton, and Justin Brooks to open our discussion of active matter. As you've heard from Peter, these 3 will each begin by framing the discussion that we're going to continue tomorrow throughout the day-long symposium, and we'll actually be relying on them for closing remarks tomorrow after the program. Admir Mashik is the Esther and Harold E. Egerton Career Development Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's interested in understanding the structural and mechanical characteristics of complex biological and archaeological materials. His research group explores ancient technologies as a source of inspiration in the development of a new generation of more durable and sustainable building materials. A former Bosnian refugee, he's also the faculty founder and director of MIT REACT, an initiative launched in May 2017 when the challenge of refugee education was presented at MIT. MIT REACT identifies, aggregates, and cultivates ideas, solutions, and best practices that allows talented refugees and forcibly displaced populations worldwide to access learning resources and professional development opportunities. Glenn Wharton is the clinical professor in museum studies at New York University, where he teaches and writes about managing contemporary art and social justice programming in museums. He's well known to those of us in the conservation field, and in fact, just today, I've referenced his article on chocolate conservation. He's the co-director of the Artist Archive Initiative at NYU, a project designed to promote research and disseminate knowledge about the work of contemporary artists. From 2007 to 2013, Glenn served as media conservator at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York, and he established the time-based media conservation program for video, performance, and software-based collections. In 2006, he founded Voices in Contemporary Art and served as its first executive director until 2010. He's currently an emeritus board member. Glenn received his PhD in conservation from the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, and his master's from the Cooperstown Graduate Program in New York. Justin Brooks is professor of philosophy at Brown University. He received his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University and has now taught at Brown for over a decade. He works on ideas of substance and matter in the early modern period and the reception of the Aristotelian tradition in Locke and others at the time. He has published on substance, Hume, color and color blindness, Plato, and the philosophy of Iris Murdoch. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Mashik.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to share with you my experience in this interdisciplinary domain of materials and conservation, which is definitely a topic that was part of my work for many years. Can we start with the slides, please? So the title of this 20 minutes talk is natural fibers, preservation of old and inspiration from the new. And I will. This is the outline, and it's quite ambitious outline for 20 minutes of my talk. But we will start with the biological strategies for high performance fibers. And I will give a few examples of those and then move to a response of these fibers to environments, which is a very important topic, especially when it comes to conservation. And then I will conclude with a practical example of preservation strategies for Dead Sea Scrolls. So if we look at this slide here, we see a lot of examples of biological materials and fibers that evolved through this biological process of evolution, and basically we can see that there are fibers in our extracellular matrix, such as collagen or spider silk, to build the webs. We have, for example, a nice giant squid, 2 meters big squid that you can find in very few places in the world and catch. We went to find them in Baja California in Mexico. But this squid has, for example, tentacles, and on these tentacles suckers that have a very special protein that is the hardest protein in the world, and actually is 3D printable. So this is the only example of 3D printable material made out of protein. And the secrets of these properties you can find in these papers here. The last picture here shows a very interesting fiber that Byssal uses to attach on the rocks, and this incredible fiber is both hard and stretchy. So I'm showing this overview slide simply because there is very important aspect of all these examples that I mentioned. They have a very specific function, but also they are all non-living. They are extruded and put into a specific environment that can be extracellular matrix here, outside in the in the fog, or here in contact with the seawater, in both cases. But all of these examples are fibers that are theoretically not living, not active. But you will learn from this 15-20 minutes conversation that they are very active and respond to environmental challenges and conditions. So let me start with showing you this example of a Byssal thread that can adhere under water. Have you ever seen a glue that can be used underwater? There is no glue that can help us gluing things underwater. And these animals simply deposit a protein that again it's in the outside in the seawater, and attaches to any kind of substrate. And basically these threads can be stretched up to 70%, even further. So they are stretchy, but they are at the same time hard. Two properties when you talk to a material scientist that are completely diverging. So you see in the one system you have three functions. Adhesion underwater that we don't know how to do. There are fibers that are stretchy and hard at the same time, and so it's a very interesting substrate to look at. I'm showing also and a nice ancient Mediterranean tradition of using these fibers to build a fabric. It's a very interesting and a beautiful story that you could look into. In any case, let's go back to this material perspective of these fibers, which, as I said, are very extensible. You see here graphs, you can pull them quite much, but interestingly, they are also self-healing. Means that once you stretch that fiber, and leave it for 24 hours, it comes back into an initial state with the properties that reflect the first curve that you see here. So again, very interesting in terms of material properties, and very active when it comes to something that was extruded and put into the environment. And we went really deep into understanding of these properties, and turned out that you have in the sequence, so protein sequence is really like molecules that get into a polymer. I don't know how much of you understand what I'm talking about. I'm afraid there is a big challenge, and we can use this time together to go deeper into understanding of this. But what this image says here is that we have a polymer that is made of different units put together at the molecular scale, so really small scale, but then processed, post-processed, so that you introduce a specific amino acid into the sequence. And this amino acid will determine those properties that I was talking about. And so we are understanding these properties through applying different characterization tools, and turned out that metal coordination crosslinks of this specific post-translational modification that occurs where animal starts to extrude those proteins to make the fibers, threads, that makes magic happen, and you get this material with a coating that has more metal coordination in the granules and less around, and when you stretch it, actually these granules only deform instead of breaking apart. And this basically leads to this toughness of the material and hardness of the material that then can heal, returning these cracks here through metal coordination bonds back into initial situation. So this is a very clear example of a very complex biologically encoded material that is designed macroscopically, starting from the very molecular level interactions. And this is the biggest challenge for us to understand, but these are the basis to understand most of the biological materials. Now I will go quickly through other examples here. Here is the cocoon of silkworm, and these are fibers at the electron microscope. And here is the example of collagen fibers in the skin. So you will now look at the schematic representations of these fibers, and you see this is the fiber at the macroscopic scale, what we see with our eyes, and this fiber then goes into a kind of hierarchically organized structural features that span from a macroscopic centimeters and millimeter scale down to the nanometer scale organizations. And you will see that there is a universality between these two examples that I just mentioned, between collagen and silk, that basically goes from fibers to fibrils. Fibrils, the nanoscale organized in a specific manner, and then they are bound with a very weak bonding here, hydrogen bonding. And here I show also bond, just to tell you that if you put the mineral here between in these fibers, you get a completely new, not anymore fluffy tissue, but bone. So nature plays with these raw materials to build hierarchically organized structures. And you will be shocked if I show you cellulose compared to silk or keratin of our hair. Incredibly, again, we are seeing very similar organization at the different length scales that go down to nanometer scale interactions and organization. Very important is to say that there is an universal strategy, and we are trying to understand how these processes occur. Let me focus on now on silk and collagen, as I promised before. And if you see a response to hydration, you will see that collagen expands and silk contracts. And you say, wait a second, I mean, they are all both proteins, they are hierarchically organized, but if you put it in water, one will contract, another one will expand. We are returning to this concept of biological encoding of properties through specifically building these molecules at the very beginning, at the amino acid building blocks, at the level of those. Let me give you an example of supercontraction. Again, I will go quickly through these slides simply because there are a lot of technical aspects. In any case, dragline silk, spider silk, contracts up to 50% when interacts with water. And this is probably due to the fact that once a spider puts this web and overnight and catches prey, and then you have water condensation in the morning, all the web starts to be quite heavy. You see here the water, and so you see there could be this reason to then change slightly protein composition to fulfill that requirements of holding once the weight gets from the water from outside. So response to the external condition could be the reason. In any case, you see we understood most of the structure using characterization tools where we've climbed the fiber here, shine a lot of lasers and X-rays and understand the behavior of, so this is the amino acid sequence with the specific amino acid groups in that sequence, and we we understand the properties through characterization, but also build the models, computational models to follow these processes. And it turned out that if you just change 3 amino acids in the sequence with the others that are different in terms of chemistry, you completely basically vanish that supercontraction effect. It's really very much related to specific chemical features of these 3 amino acids on 2 sides of these crystals of silk, beta sheets. All right. So let me go now on the collagen side. We said if we dry collagen, it contracts, and this is kind of standard. So if we put water, things expand, you know. So the interesting of collagen is that if you take a fiber, collagen fiber, in this case we use the rat tail tendon, and you clamp it and fix it, and then you dry it, it generates forces that go beyond the forces that we use for our muscles to move this arm. So there is a property of force generation of collagen just by cycling the humidity from 10% to 90%. And these forces goes beyond the imaginable that with colleagues, Peter Fratzel will give a talk tomorrow, and maybe he will mention this exact paper. The forces that we managed to measure go so far that actually we think that the silk, that skin, you see the skin is actually under tension continuously. If you cut, it opens, simply because of these properties of collagen that you can tune by changing environmental conditions. In any case, let me move quickly forward. What I want to show you, this is a typical setting of material scientists, where we basically put the sample here in the chamber and then shine a lot of X-rays and detect the properties, characteristics of this sample in this detector. So this is the schematics. Then we change the conditions through humidity generators and things like that. And this is a computational model of the same collagen, in which basically you can in theory follow every molecule of water in this. So these are chains of protein chains, and these are red spots are water molecules. And theoretically, we could really have a picture of water interacting with collagen at the very molecular scale. Of course, through these techniques, we were able to understand clearly what happens to collagen when it dries, and this contraction is driven by conformational changes of molecule and heterogeneous behavior at the level of nanoscale, where gap and overlap, specific property of collagen, behaves differently. So, I don't know how much time do I have to finish this 20 minutes talk, and I would like to show you how this knowledge of, let's say, material science could inform us in very complex materials, such as ancient manuscript written on parchment. So parchments, and this is an example of temple scroll, Dead Sea scrolls that were found in these caves on the shores of the Dead Sea in Israel, and arrived to us because probably were put into these jars that kept them in a very controlled environment in the cave, the standard constant humidity and temperature. And they are actually made, this is an example of scroll as it was found in the 40s, and basically they are made out of animal skin. And so if you think about processing animal skin, you will of course think of collagen. And indeed you have the main component of parchments is collagen network. In any case, I don't know if you are familiar with the story of these manuscripts. So they are like 2,000 years old, and there is a very nice story about 4 of these Cubans. You can see it here, that basically arrived to the States at one point. Because we actually had no idea how valuable they are, and how important they are in terms of covering very interesting period of time before and after Jesus was born, and so this man here found in both 4 manuscripts in Jerusalem, and then after not being able to sell them, he moved to the States here. And this is the picture actually that I found at the Harvard Art Museum, where he is showing one example of this scroll. Unfortunately, there was not so much interest in buying these, even though he was convinced that they are really old, they are very important. He couldn't sell them. And then what he did, what do you think? He put in a Wall Street Journal ad. Let's read it together. I can't. I mean, this educational part is absolutely wonderful. In any case, eventually people did realize that they are very important, and then there was a race to buy those scrolls, and there is a kind of a funny story. You can find it, and if not, I can tell you later on about how they ended up back to Jerusalem and now stored in the Shrine of the Book. By the way, very beautiful museum in Jerusalem that hosts most of the manuscripts. But turning to the material culture now, I mean, there are 900 very fragmented manuscripts that are quite challenging when it comes to the conservation. And you see they go from a very beautiful white, quite well preserved, to fragments that appear very degraded. Color-wise, they change radically also because they were differently prepared. Some were tanned on the surface, and others were treated differently. In some sense, very, very challenging to preserve. Also because they had a really challenging life after the discovery. Not only in these caves, but if you look at this picture, I must say, you can imagine the situation on the fragments here that were actually glued in some cases with scotch, or applied several oils to enhance the contrast of the letters and things like that. So post-discovery handling and preservation strategies of that time definitely induced a lot of changes, and I like this quote here from a friend of mine in Harvard University, James Weir, in which he defined this mineral-coated collagen. These are examples of one fragment. This is a letter, so this is ink, and this is parchment. you can still at the molecular, let's say at the nanoscale, see some collagen preserved. But this image here tells you, it's collected by James Weaver, as I said, from Harvard University. It's a map, quite a large map of temple scroll, in which you see elements. I don't know if you can read here, but there is sodium, carbon red. It's fibers of collagen, you know. But you see calcium, iron, phosphorus everywhere. So there is a very difficult substrate to look at, and indeed he defined it like mineral-coated collagen. In any case, there are here current researchers, of course, focus on the ancient technology of production that could be really interesting in understanding. It's still a huge debate around how they were made, you know, drying under tension and treatments to produce. And it's very difficult to distinguish what arrived from that cigarette ash and what actually was used to make them. So you do understand the material science perspective and challenges that we do face every single day. And where I'm very much focused is quantitatively understand and monitor, you know, deterioration and suggest preservation strategies on these manuscripts. So the strategy is quite linear in terms of, you know, we do know, and you'll learn from me, that we do know how to characterize on the different scales. We introduce external stimuli that can be temperature, humidity, pollution. We are now getting better and better in multi-scale modeling. That can be a really powerful tool to avoid a lot of experiments, and maybe some of them do in silico, and then develop strategies. So here is an example of artificially aged new parchment that we treated for 32 days at 80 degrees centigrades. You know, this is quite a harsh treatment, but interestingly, nothing happened, and we believe that nothing happened because of this humidity, 40% relative humidity. Only parameter that changes in this next slide is 80% relative humidity, and you go from these fibers into completely gelatinized glass-like layers on top of the parchment, which is quite an important result, saying that actually if you combine heating and humidity, you end up into this situation. And this is very important also. Okay, jello. This we did understand that is nothing else than gelatinized collagen that turned into this specific phase, which is, you see, brittle. This is very important to notice. It cracks on the surface. It's not jello that we know. It's kind of dehydrated jello. Okay, so like very compact, brittle jello. Okay, but this is a temple scroll SEM image, and if you look at this image, you do realize that these manuscripts are quite gelatinized in the surface with cracks. You do see the features, and you see the fibers underneath of these cracked layers. Exactly what we observed in artificially aged. And then what we did, we tried to actually understand why, how humidity could affect this specific situation in which we have a very brittle, stiff layers on top of fibers. And this is a gelatinized layer in the computational model, and this is collagen. And after we learned about these forces that were generated just by cycling humidity from 10 to 90 and back, we were able to build a model in which represents that exact situation. And this is the zoom in into the interface, and we notice that there is here stretch generation at the interface that goes beyond that collagen gelatinized layer cracking and fracturing. So every time that this, hypothetically in the computational model, cycle goes on, we do have a cracking and stresses at the interface between collagen and gelatin, indicating that in the real sample, we could expect that there are micro cracks going on every single time that that fragment goes from 10% relative humidity to 90% and back. Okay, so you see it's a very active, very dynamic process that depends on the properties of every single part of that collagen, mineral-coated collagen, very complex, but still we are getting there in understanding the processes that could be associated with the damage here. All right. So, in conclusion, I think I'm really glad to be here to talk about active matter. I gave you this materials perspective of active matter in terms of biology, building materials, multifunction materials that respond, are very active, and I concluded with the Dead Sea Scrolls that are a very beautiful example of how this knowledge from material perspective could inform us with this aim and help us to save these valuable objects. And with this, I would conclude my talk. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to thank the Bild Graduate Center for inviting me to this important evening, launching a new 5-year research project on active matter. I have to admit I find it a little bit daunting to be sandwiched between a material scientist from MIT and a philosopher. After all, what could I add as a conservator? I will get back to that at the end of my presentation with some thoughts. I began researching this presentation by trying to figure out what active matter meant to various disciplines, and I realized that the term is used in multiple disciplines, in the natural sciences, in the material sciences. I'll begin with the material sciences, and I'll just read you a definition that I found by Schuyler Tibbets, also at MIT. He says that active matter is a newly emerging field focused on physical materials that can assemble themselves, transform autonomously, and sense, react, and compute based on internal and external information. He goes on to say that the aims of active matter research is to design and create active, intelligent, and dynamic materials with new emerging fabrication techniques, design tools, and material processes. So I then scratched my head wondering what this had to do with conservation. I can tell you right off the bat that conservators may or may not think of materials as smart, but they certainly think of materials as active. I'm this fall spending a few months at the Getty Conservation Institute in Los Angeles, and I'm paired with a granite conservator. One of the first things I just had to say was, granite doesn't need conservation. And he said, oh yes it does. He launched into a long lecture about grains of stone and how they disintegrate, how they undergo oxidation and chemical reactions and exfoliate. And before I knew I was agreeing with him, granite is a very active material. So I'd like to, in this presentation, discuss active matter in conservation the way I see it. And I'm bringing up two different case studies. The first is cellulose nitrate, cellulose acetate sculpture made by Russian constructivist artists. And the second is cathode ray television tubes made by the artist Namjoon Paik, and the constellations of people coming to these specific problems, doing interdisciplinary research, and arriving at very, what I would call, creative decisions about how to respond to this active matter. So starting with cellulose nitrate sculpture, this is an Antoine Pevsner sculpture composed in 1924-26. It's actually made of cellulose nitrate, cellulose acetate, and copper. And as you can see, it's altered over time. If you ask a conservator, they will tell you that, of course, cellulose nitrate reacts with oxygen, ultraviolet light, humidity, and undergoes various kinds of chemical and physical reactions. It yellows, it shrinks, it cracks, it distorts. If you ask an art historian about the sculpture, they will tell you that the Russian constructivists were very interested in expressing modernity through the use of these new early plastics. They wanted to create an object that was clear, and they were very excited about the fact that you could do things with clear plastics, man-made plastics, that you couldn't do with glass. So this object clearly doesn't express the artist's intentions from that point of view. Conservation questions are, what do we do? Do we exhibit it as it is? Do we make a replica, maybe, in cellulose nitrate? Or do we make a replica in some other clear plastic that wouldn't yellow over time? Or do we assign it to storage? Do we just call it dead? It no longer communicates what the artist wanted to communicate, and maybe we should just relegate it to storage in a study collection. This was made by Pevsner's brother, Naum, model for construction in space, 2 cones. It's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And it's deteriorated to the point where it no longer is exhibitable. Gabo was so upset by the condition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art that he made this replica, and he gave the replica to the Tate. And so he made it in 1968. This is the way it looked in 1997, and you can see it's already started to yellow. So materials are already started to alter. And this is actually how it looked in 2007. This is the original sculpture at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Now, conservation, as I mentioned, is a process of people coming together, doing material research, doing art historical research, doing other kinds of research, bringing in artists, technical experts, and arriving at decisions. And as I mentioned before, I think of this as a creative process in the end. But creativity comes in many forms. This is actually a work of art. It's a sculpture made by Marianne Viero, and she worked with conservators, with technicians. She worked with staff at the Philadelphia Museum of Art to take measurements of the deteriorated Naum in the collection, and she made this sculpture in 3D production in different materials from the original, and I have to say, not necessarily stable materials, so we don't know where the sculpture is going to go. But from her point of view, this sculpture is in conversation with Gabo's deteriorated sculpture at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I think this conversation between these two objects can have really interesting implications for conservation itself, to think of this sort of creative expression of decisions that are made in response to active materials, and the decisions are often different. And that's what I'd like to show you now. This is a work that I conserved and managed the conservation of at MoMA. It's Untitled, or Piano, by Namjoon Paik. It consists of a upright standing piano with 15 cathode ray tube televisions stacked on top of it and on side of it. He modified the piano to be with a player piano unit, so it plays jazz music really loud in the gallery. It's also a 4-channel video sculpture in that there are 2 security cameras mounted on the piano, one of them capturing live feed of the keys moving, the other capturing live feed of the hammers moving. And the two other channels are colorized psychedelic video that's a tribute to John Cage. And so there's a lot of images from his life. And I would like to just play it for a moment, if I can. Okay, where is the... Active matter. So every single element of this sculpture had conservation problems. I'm not going to go through all of them or the decisions that we made. I'll focus on the television sets. So we formed a group of a team of people. There were 3 conservators, curators, audiovisual technicians at the museum. We brought in staff from the Albright Knox Museum because they have a very similar work by Nam June Paik. We consulted with the director and the curator at the Nam June Paik Studios. We did a lot of our own research, deciding what to do. And what we did, again, focusing just on the televisions, was to test each television to see whether they were working or not, measure the color on each one of them. 2 of them weren't functioning. We decided to work with C.T. Louis, who is an electronics engineer who used to work with Nam June Paik, and he's still in New York, running an electronics repair shop off of Canal Street. He sourced 2 vintage televisions of the same size, and we harvested the internal workings of those televisions and placed them inside the original casings of televisions that we had, so they're now functioning. We also purchased 2 complete backup sets, so 30 television sets, for future staff at the museum to be able to harvest either the internal guts of the TVs or just the entire TVs to replace on exhibits. So they're in storage waiting to be handled. Now, as I said earlier, different constellations of people in different situations may respond to very similar situations in different ways. At the Guggenheim Museum, this is an installation called TV Garden. It's been displayed multiple times, and each time early in its life it was displayed, new televisions were purchased for the installation. So there were no dedicated televisions that went with the work. And this is the way the artist wanted it. After the artist died, however, and cathode ray tube television sets were very hard to source on the market, the conservators, the curators, and others thought very hard, researched the artist, and they finally made a decision to freeze the work technically in time, meaning that they bought 2 complete backup sets of cathode ray tube televisions instead of going to flat screen televisions. They just thought, no, if the artist was alive, he might have wanted us to move to flat screen technology. In fact, he did that in some cases, but their feeling, because of his love for cathode ray tube technology, was to maintain that technology. So that's a certain decision that this group of people made. At the Smithsonian Art Museum, they made a very different decision. With this robot made by Nam June Paik, there's, as you can see, some portable television sets that were cathode ray tube, and they weren't working. It was impossible at the time of conservation to find other portable television sets of this size on the market. So what they decided to do, because Nam June Paik actually had replaced some cathode ray tubes with flat screens, they took the original casings, they purchased really high quality monitors with flat screens and inserted them in the casings. So you have the original casings, but the screen is actually flat. So someone, a historian of technology, might scratch their head, what's going on here? So they made a completely different decision. At LACMA, with this video wall, they made what I think is a very creative decision. As you can see, there's a wood screen with all of the cathode ray tube televisions behind it. So all you see of the cathode ray tube televisions is the front of the casing. And many of them weren't working at the time they did this conservation project. So they decided to take the front of the casing, purchase high-quality rounded cathode ray tube screen televisions, and attach them to the front of the casing. So you get these very curious kind of hybrid objects that one couldn't exhibit in a museum as such. But since they were behind this wall, what you see on exhibition is the original casings poking through. You don't see that new technology that was added to the televisions. So this brings me to the other group of researchers that I've identified that use this term active matter in the natural world. I'm going to read you their definition of active matter. This is from the Brandeis University Active Matter Initiative in the physics department. They define it as systems whose constituent elements consume energy and are thus out of equilibrium. Examples include flocks or herds of animals, collections of cells, and components of the cellular cytoskeleton. When these objects interact with each other, collective behavior can emerge that is unlike anything possible in an equilibrium system. This is a very different concept of what active matter is. I think related, but different. It turns out that birds, when they're flying, or at least starlings and some other birds, are interacting with 5 to 7 birds that are around them. And as they interact, the next 5 to 7 birds are interacting, the next 5 to 7 birds, and so you get these amazing patterns of birds flying. I'm going to just, oh, I thought I was going to keep playing this. Oh, there we go. Found the right button. So I, of course, was mesmerized by all these videos I started to watch online, these birds flying, and thinking, okay, what does this have to do with conservation? And of course, my mind went to the social part of conservation, the networking in conservation, these constellations of people that come together to do research from different disciplines and make decisions. And just as 5 to 7 birds may be in communication with each other, it might be 5 to 7 professional colleagues influencing each other and making decisions that might be very different from one institution to another. And hopefully these constellations of people making their decisions in our field will actually publish their decisions or share their work in conferences or even through social media, and they can impact other groups of people faced with very similar problems. They won't necessarily dictate the solutions that are made by others, but they can at least influence them. And this is how conservation moves forward. So I'd like to just step back at this point and think about what I've told you about the cellulose nitrate sculptures and all the different options for conservation and the different decisions that are made, cathode ray tube television sets with Nam June Paik, the different decisions that are made. And I could have given you examples in contemporary art from performance art, software-based art, and so on. But what does this all take us to in terms of the active matter research in conservation at the Bard Graduate Center? So it seems to me that the Bard Graduate Center has taken on a huge project to think through what's next in conservation. What can conservation move towards. And it seems to me that we're already working interdisciplinary. Maybe we already have, always have, but we certainly are now. We just routinely work with curators, material scientists, artists, technicians, and so on to arrive at creative decision making. This project is to situate that research in a larger landscape of intellectual work. And as I said at the very beginning of the lecture, I was asking myself, what can I offer when there's material scientists and philosophers and others in other fields? It reminded me of some research that I did recently on artist intent. I wanted to write a paper on artist intentions in the conservation of contemporary art. So I began by researching that phrase in multiple fields. What do philosophers mean by artist intention? What do sociologists, anthropologists, art historians mean? And I realized that they all use this phrase differently. And so my preliminary decision was conservators shouldn't even use this phrase. We've got it all wrong. All these other experts are using it, and we don't use it the same way. I mentioned this to Jim Coddington, who was at that point the chief conservator at MoMA, and he said, well, maybe conservators have their own way of using the term. And that was like a light bulb went off for me. I guess I had some kind of a disciplinary inferiority complex that I thought that we had to go to other people to bring in knowledge so we can make decisions. But maybe, just maybe, the kind of work that we do with active matter, researching materials, researching technology, bringing in artist intentions and anthropological concerns, concerns of indigenous populations, and coming to these decisions and doing physical manipulations, maybe we do arrive at new understandings that might just be helpful to other scholars in the humanities, social sciences, material sciences. So I would just like to leave it there and offer that as a challenge to the Bard Graduate Center in this project to see if they can help move the field forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here and also feeling intimidated, particularly because I don't have any visuals. There will be no images I have to offer. I will be appealing to your memory, if you have it, of a couple of Dürer engravings, but they're so well known that I expect you'll all bring them to mind. It would be nice if you could bring some Fluxus imagery to mind too at a certain point. I'm going to try to talk about two main things, and there'll be a little bit at the beginning, a little bit at the end as a sort of add-on. The main things are how a particularly inert conception of matter was promoted in the 17th century, and how there was an awful lot of pushback at the time, not just among old-fashioned Aristotelians, but among people who could definitely only be described as also part of the world of the moderns. So you've got Locke and Descartes defending something that's really quite dead about matter, and then you have a large number of people like Leibniz and Cudworth who are pushing back, and it's very interesting to see what they're arguing over and how much, in fact, I think physics has in some ways proved itself to be a descendant of what they're paying attention to as much as what the other people on the more traditionally atomist physics side of the boundary are doing. The second line of thought that I'm wanting to look at is Hume and the theory of identity. One of the big questions that's obviously being thought about by people here is what kind of transformations of an object constitute survival for it? What kinds of transformation constitute the thing going out of existence? And Hume is a very strong example. I have to say strong, but also I think completely weak, because it's a very apparent when you look at him, how unsustainable the view is, but he is at least a firm defender of the view that if you have any change whatsoever, then you don't actually have the same object. You only get persistence when a thing remains unchanging. Now, why people should be attracted by that view is a deep question, and I'm only going to be, skirting it. So, let me begin with something from the 14th century and an Egyptian encyclopedia by Shihab ad-Din al-Nuwayri, known as the Ultimate Ambition in the Arts of Erudition. It's an absolutely huge encyclopedia, and I've only read the short selections from it that have been translated into English, but there are some interesting and sharp words against the use of hair dye to disguise greying hair. We're told that the Prophet Muhammad said, "The grey hairs of the Muslim will be a light for them on the day of the resurrection." And a prophetic tradition is reported. The first person to go grey was Abraham, peace be upon him. So he said, "My Lord, what is this?" Referring to his hair, unfortunately, at a certain moment. And God replied, "Dignity." And Abraham said, "Lord, increase my dignity." Now, the fact that these stories need to be told makes me think that at the time of the encyclopedia, there probably was a very fast business in the selling of hair dye to disguise the changes that were taking place with time. Now, my interest today is in identity and in change, and some of the philosophical conceptions that have promoted the idea that the ideal form of continuance in existence is an unchanging one. Now, first of all, some debates about the nature of matter on the part of philosophers in the 17th century, early 18th century. You've got in Descartes a conception of matter as solely consisting in extension. That means if something takes up space, then it is matter. Now, people came along and pointed out, isn't this a little bit difficult, because we might want to say that there was such a thing as a vacuum, and a vacuum could take up space, and yet it isn't filling the space. So they said you need extension plus something else like impenetrability, which is keeping other things out of that space. That's the position that Locke takes, and curiously, the debate between Locke and Descartes is a rerun of a debate between the mathematicians and the physicists in the ancient period that gets reported in Sextus Empiricus. So it's very curious that we look on Locke and Descartes as, so to speak, new revolutionaries who are supposed to have brought all kinds of nice, exciting new ideas. But for example, on this topic, they're really repeating debates that were around 1500, 1600 years before. But both Descartes and Locke coincided in the view that, in a certain sense, activity was no special part of matter. In a certain sense, matter interacted with matter, but all it ever did, effectively, was push it about. Locke says the only way that we can conceive matter acts upon matter is by impulse, and he means by impulse impelling, that is pushing, bumping. It's one billiard ball bumps into another one and makes it move. Now, it's interesting that no sooner had Locke come up with this claim than, and actually used it essentially in his philosophy, than Newton's statements about gravitation made it rather hard to defend, because in the case of gravitational attraction, you've got bodies not bumping into other bodies, but apparently actually pulling them at a distance. So it seems, I mean, there are many ways that one could develop alternative views, but at least at a first glance, it looks as though you've got something like action at a distance, and it doesn't consist in pushing, it consists in something more like pulling. Now, you also had a different kind of quite radical worry on the part of Leibniz. Now, this is a fairly abstract issue, but it's an interesting and a very fundamental one, and it's interesting again that the debate, such as it was, in many ways echoed a debate from, in this case, 2,000 more years before, when Zeno had made his comments about the arrow. You remember, he comes to the conclusion that an arrow never moves. Now, of course, he knew that this was somewhat counterintuitive, in conflict with everyday thought. He felt he had a very firm argument that persuaded you that the arrow couldn't really move. The argument went like this: at any one instant, an arrow can't be said to be moving. At any one instant, an arrow can only be said to be just where it is, occupying the space that it's in. At an instant, it isn't, so to speak, smudgily occupying more than one space. An arrow just is wherever it might be. And for a thing to move, well, sorry, I'll come back to that in just another second. The second premise for Zeno is, if a thing doesn't move at any instant, then it doesn't move through a period. Conclusion, well, in that case, nothing ever moves at all. Now, the standard reply that many people came up with was, look, there's an easy way out from this. It is that all motion consists in is being in one place at one time, being at another place at another time, and in the normal cases, being at intervening places during the intervening times. But on this view, an arrow isn't literally going to be said to have some special property of being in motion at a particular instant. There is no well-defined property of it being in motion at an instant, except as a kind of roundabout way of talking about how it had been a moment before in another nearby place, and at nearby times afterwards it's going to be in a nearby place. So it's not going to be an intrinsic property of the arrow to be moving at the instant that it does. But then there's suddenly the following problem. In that case, have you got any difference between a moving arrow and a stationary arrow? You take it, we like to think, that it's the state of things at one instant that determines, if anything does, what will happen afterwards in the later evolution of events in the world. But if there's no difference between the moving arrow and the stationary arrow, then how come one of them is in fact at another place afterwards than the other one? So, faced with puzzles like that, Leibniz actually said, you've got to make a real difference in herein the moving arrow, which separates it from the non-moving arrow. Leibniz says what you really need is some, now here one runs out of words, maybe you need some power in the arrow, maybe what you need is some intrinsic momentum, maybe you need something which is just specially active about it. And he thought that in some ways this is very like sort of having a soul, maybe that. Other people, not Leibniz, but other people building upon this, have said, no, it just shows that in a certain sense the physics needs to be a little more open-minded about what you place in the world. It isn't necessary, so to speak, to bring in souls from outside. It's just necessary to enrich your conception of what the nature of the stuff in the world is. So there were a number of debates like that which were getting people excited about the idea that matter had to be a whole lot more active, I mean at least some of the time when it's moving, for example, than was recognized within the central and since dominant tradition that Locke and Descartes have represented. Now, I might just mention one kind of interesting figure who placed a lot of emphasis upon the need for active matter. Ralph Cudworth was a Cambridge philosopher of the 1660s, 70s, 80s. He was in a tradition of people who sometimes now get called Cambridge Platonists, but I'm not sure how incredibly close they are to Plato, though they obviously had a huge liking for him, but I think they picked up influences all over the place. Now, in Cudworth, you get a great insistence upon the need for plastic nature. Plastic nature. Now, that very phrase is apt to be understood by us in precisely the opposite way from the way it was intended. Plastic today may suggest to us something in a way unnatural, created, and possibly, when you think of things becoming things which are thermoplastic will soften with heat, and that makes them more able to be manipulated. But that's a passive, accepting of a change of conformation. What actually Cudworth had in mind by plastic nature is capable of forming other things. Plastic, if you look it up in Dr. Johnson's dictionary of 1756, is given only one explanatory paraphrase, having the power to give form. To be plastic was to be capable of forming something. So plastic nature is a nature that will actually form, create, have an effect upon other things. God himself is talked of at times as being having a plastic hand, having a plastic influence upon things, a formative, a modeling, a transforming influence. So, here is Cudworth emphasizing the plastic nature of matter. I shan't go into much about why he really thought we needed to recognize there was a plastic nature to matter. It's partly he just thought that with the inactive matter, such as was offered to us by Descartes and Locke, with that, Locke hadn't actually published his material, but it's quite possible that Cudworth knew about it. His daughter was Damaris Masham, was married to the man who Locke spent the later part of his sort of retirement years living with. They formed people said it was a complex ménage à trois, with this slightly dull member of parliament, the daughter of Damaris Cudworth, daughter of Cudworth, Ralph Cudworth, and Locke as a third figure living in their house for many years. Anyway, that's sorry, I should have begun that, but I. So let me think. Let me move on now to the second sort of central thing, which is Hume and the conception of matter, ideally not just individual lumps of matter, but larger things that are obviously formed of many parts. Those things having as their fundamental nature to survive, to continue, only by being unchanged. Hume goes on, this is in his Treatise of Human Nature, 1739, 1740, in 3 books. And it's in the discussion of personal identity, he starts out by trying to give you an account of identity. And he explains there is a very important distinction between a thing continuing invariable and uninterrupted, and on the other hand, getting a sequence of things which are in some ways interrelated with each other but are constantly changing. And he wants to say they're utterly different in reality, but they have a very similar effect upon the mind. The mind is a not very discriminating thing, and when presented with a slowly changing thing that changes only in a small degree, you easily mix it up with a thing that isn't changing at all. And that, he thinks, is why you say, oh, it's the same thing. So, having told you that it's really, really not the same thing, he then goes on as a kind of psychologist to try to explain the cases in which we kind of let go by things as if they were the same, even though they're not genuinely the same. His 4 main points are: we tend not to notice when the change is relatively small in proportion to the whole. He says the addition of a mountain doesn't make much change in what we think of as a whole planet, but in other cases, with just a very small object, a change of just a few inches will make us count something as really a different object, replacing the old one. Secondly, he says we tend not to care when the change is gradual. Thirdly, he says we tend not to mind when there is what you might call a constant reference to a common end. That is, a kind of a purpose that is maintained through the change in the material composition of the thing. So, for example, a ship may have its timbers changed, but as long as it can go on at sea, going on the same journeys, you say, oh, it's the same ship, it's just been repaired here. Finally, he says we actually pay attention especially to a kind of mutual interaction of parts, and he talks of a sympathy of parts. And he says that's what's going on in the case of vegetables, he means by that plants and trees and so on, and animals. In those cases, he says there's actually a total change of the matter, but over a lifetime anyway, and yet we ascribe identity to these things. And that's because there is a kind of organic organization. Now, and that organization survives through the replacement of the little bits. Now, he goes on to make actually 2 additional points. One is about how we actually can go as far as allowing that we come back to the church of this village when it might turn out that the church was actually pulled down and a new one was rebuilt, and you still regard it as the village church, even though there's, total replacement. Secondly, and I think really particularly interestingly, he actually talks of certain objects that are in their nature changeable. He says the nature of a river consists in motion and change of parts. And what is natural and essential is also expected, and it appears therefore for us of less importance. Now, I would say it's rather strange that he should say these objects are in their nature changeable, when he also, on his official view, if I've understood it rightly, has been really wanting to say, but still, strictly speaking, the river goes out of existence just as soon as it begins to flow. And I would say, isn't that a sign that something went wrong with the original idea that change always means losing the original object? On the contrary, there are some objects that only even begin to exist because they change. And the prime examples would be the ones of actually the tradition that was dominant before Locke and Descartes and Hume were around, namely the Aristotelian tradition, for whom the prime examples of an object are things like a cat or a dog or a horse or perhaps a tree. And these are things which, if they don't change, don't even exist. I mean, if you've got a dog and it doesn't breathe, then it's not an up and running dog. It's got to be doing some change to exist at all, at all, at all. Same is true, surely, of rivers. So I'm inclined to say that on this particular issue, Hume was on the wrong side. The active matter conception was very much more on the right side. Now, I don't know if I've got time to say a few things just it's not quite in conclusion, it's leading up to the conclusion. Can I steal a few minutes for the... Thank you. Talking of artworks that have a tendency to go out of existence, I couldn't help thinking of the report that you get a few pages into the life of Michelangelo in Vasari's Lives, where it's described that Piero de' Medici, who had long been familiar with Michelangelo, often sent for him, wishing to buy antique cameos and other intaglios, and one snowy winter he got him to build a beautiful snow statue in the courtyard of his palace. And so one wonders what would have constituted, if such a thing had made any sense at all, an attempt at conservation for this thing, and whether it would have conceivably fitted in with the artist's aim, which might well have been just to make a snowman that might actually melt. It's an instance that's had a great effect upon quite a number of writers' imaginations. Elizabeth Barrett Browning puts the snow sculpture into a poem of hers, and Ruskin, in his Political Economy of Art, devotes an angry page or two to it. He regards it as the intensest possible type of the greatest error which nations and princes, you can see he likes understatement, the greatest error which nations and princes can commit respecting the power of genius entrusted to their guidance. Namely, the error is that when you have the strongest genius in the most perfect obedience, capable of the very highest achievement, then its governor, guide, and patron sets it to build a statue in snow, to put itself into the service of annihilation, to make a cloud of itself and pass away from the earth. I wonder if Ruskin isn't overdoing it a bit and these people are just having fun making snowmen. But I'd like to talk to you about what strikes me as a perhaps Ruskinian and perhaps non-Ruskinian moment. Now, I have a memory of a visit to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford a bit over 15 years ago. It all just came back to me about 10 days ago when I was thinking about the issues that we were going to be talking about today. And I remember I wanted to look at the prints that they have of Dürer's St. Eustace. And they have three impressions. One is a fine impression in very good condition. I saw one of the other two, which I think belonged to Ruskin, and as I remember it, it's a very late impression. You can tell that the plate had become very worn at the time when it was taken, and the impression was taken, and it had also undergone a kind of second transformation because somebody who had owned it, possibly earlier than Ruskin, had folded it and folded it a second time, and as far as I can see, might easily have slipped it in between the back pages of a book and shoved it into a large pocket and carried it with him as a talisman, a companion, a inspiration, just a great thing to have with him. Unfolded, as I looked at it, it was in a sense damaged and also in a sense renewed, while the very tiredness of the plate that had lost its fine detail in a way seemed actually to justify the carefree use that the print had since been put to. Now, it struck me in my memory as a thing of great beauty, though I'd never imagined I would be writing about it and I hadn't taken any notes on it. Well, I contacted the Ashmolean to see if they could help me with this. After a few rounds of inquiry, I learned that they had indeed three prints of St. Eustace, and one had indeed been Ruskin's, but that particular print showed no sign of having been folded. I also remembered seeing the master engraving of St. Jerome in his study, and a print of it that had belonged to Ruskin. Yes, that was there, they replied, and they sent me some details showing quite a lot of damage to the plate and to the actual impression. But that too had not been folded. What could I have been remembering? Well, it's something I'll have to look into the next time I get to Oxford. Perhaps it will turn up, perhaps, I'm now thinking, I've just got confused in my memory. But there is in Chambers' Cyclopedia, I shall end with an encyclopedia since I began with an encyclopedia, and there is in Chambers' Cyclopedia of 1728 a marvellous subdivision of books with regard to circumstances and accidents into the lost, the promised, and the fictitious. If it should turn out that the folded Dura print of my memory should take its place with either the first or the third of those categories, I shall still count myself lucky to have encountered it. Damaged and living, it seems to me to have enjoyed a real second life that the much better preserved exemplars had not seen.
Yeah, excellent. Everybody find their seat. Thank you. So, hello. Thank you all for your presentations and sharing your respective disciplinary perspectives and perhaps evolving perspectives and experiences on active matter. I'd like to continue our discussion of active matter by asking you a few questions before taking some questions from the audience. And so first, though, I'm going to ask you all to comment on your fellow panelists' presentations, if you have any questions for them to kind of open up this interdisciplinary dialogue. So is there anybody who would like to begin? Any comments or questions? Admir, you're right here.
Not questions. I guess it's fascinating, just this panel here. I'm really glad to be part of this interdisciplinary conversation and really open my visions to art and to philosophy, which it's really a great opportunity for all of us to learn and improve.
Should we be speaking into the mics?
I think that's probably the ideal goal.
Okay.
How well do people at the back manage to hear us? Not too bad.
Well, I think it's a matter of recording.
It's the recording.
That.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do these easily come off of here?
Oh,
So
we
easy.
can just.
Well, okay. I guess I'm struck by how different we all are and how different our approaches were to even be thinking about active matter and what it means within our disciplines. And I don't have specific questions, but I'm certainly curious in the material science world what the applications of material science research that you're doing would have to conservation. You got close with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we are a profession that actually does stuff. So, and we have all kinds of values and principles, codes of ethics, and the kind of research that you're doing is really exciting, and I can see almost there that there could be some applications for adhesives that might function underwater, or materials, fibers that might expand and contract in different environments. But we would also bring on a whole other layer of concerns about the aging of these materials that we add to an object of cultural heritage. Will they themselves yellow? Will they themselves chemically interact with the original material? So I don't know if this is a question, it's just a thought that we need to do another layer of research in order to then see if these materials are sort of conservation appropriate.
Excellent. Yeah, I can comment on this one. I must say, I think with this 20 minutes I touched just tip of an iceberg when it comes to active matter and material science in general, and I must say I didn't focus at all to the bio-inspired design, and this is just one of the directions that many of the researchers are focusing and going. One example is definitely connected with the application of applying, discovering the secret of the glue that sets underwater and allows the, adhesion underwater. But we can think about many different perspectives in that specific context of bio-inspiration, and use structural features and biological design at a macroscopic scale to, react to environment and shapes. I mean, work by Katia Bertoldi at Harvard illustrates very much how origami structures can change shape, and just by designing the structural features that are then inspired by biological equivalents, produce very specific forms or shapes or mechanical performances and things like that. Neri Oxman does very much on the side of integrating biological features and creating artistic objects that are active indeed through bacteria or using biopolymers. So there is a very rich scenarios in which we can navigate and express ourselves. I like your comment about the conservation, because my work actually could really have a strong contribution in that specific context, because we are learning that actually materials are breathing in the sense that they move, they respond to environmental stimuli that can be, I presented here effects of just hydration, but there is a lot of other stimuli that we deal continuously, light, temperature, and aging naturally comes into the place, and just by understanding clearly from the materials, my very narrow kind of perspective, what is going on, which I must say it's extremely complicated. And if I think about myself talking about today to you about Dead Sea Scrolls 10 years ago, my visions changed radically, because also my field changed radically, and our tools that we are able now to use systematically and put in place to service and answer some of these challenges and questions are much better. And many of my results that people were just putting in the drawers and not using at all, and I was so excited about, I realized that were really not useful, because there were sometimes just a spectra that were not able to kind of answer complicated questions that are useful and valuable in this context. So we are getting better, and I think we are getting there in building a solid understanding from many different perspectives, and then really make this decision-making process much more solid, based on scientific evidences and visions and perspectives from many different fields.
Could I ask actually about the you talked quite a bit in fascinating ways about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it strikes me that, of course, I mean, one of the things that came out particularly from your presentation is that, in many conservation environments, there isn't going to be one right way to do things. I mean, there'll be many different solutions to a many things that probably aren't exactly a solution, many ways of accommodating to something which is a complicated situation where you're balancing imponderables that, really can't straightforwardly be, you can't say this one's important and that thing's not important. No, you're not, and if you pursue this, then you're not going to pursue that. Now, one of the things with the Dead Sea Scrolls, you would very interested in the elasticity and the
Plasticity.
Yes, plasticity in a special sense.
Exactly. Special.
Now, for some people, the Dead Sea Scrolls are of greatest importance, whether they hold together or not, because of what you can read on them or cannot read on them. And so I wondered if you could say something about the work that the chemists might have been able to do on contrast, getting greater contrast, playing around with things that are going to help the inks to come forward, that kind of thing.
I mean, that's a good point, and I must say most of the scrolls were able to be investigated through different imaging techniques that actually bring the ink itself on the surface, even though the surface is completely deteriorated and invisible to naked eye. So infrared imaging or hyperspectral imaging, we have many experts here that basically we can work on the signal excitation and then the detection to overcome and go beyond the visible spectrum and allow reading. I think the question you are asking, and also it's an important question, is, for example, should we let these fragments travel around the world and make expositions? I mean, that's a very simple question to be asked. And see, and also the answer is quite difficult, Can I, as a material scientist, contribute in that context? And I think probably we can, in a sense that we are getting there to understand what is the process of taking that fragment in Jerusalem and bringing it here in New York and expose it and then bring it back, right, which was not so easy to understand some years ago. And therefore, to answer your question, I think it's very important to understand what we want to, what is going to happen, and try to predict effects or challenges that these fragments, for example, will go through in a setting of restoration, preservation, storage, or, as I said,
and if they
traveling.
travel and if they get shaken around,
shaken around. I mean, but you see, it's a complex process that hopefully we will be able to somehow model and answer. Yes, you just take it to New York, nothing will happen. Expose it for this time in this specific conditions, and bring it back. Okay, but this it's kind of. We are just beginning.
You haven't got there yet.
Exactly.
You don't
we
have
are just beginning in understanding these complex objects that then will allow us to make these important decisions. That then I really would not be a guy that is famous for letting go and degrading these valuable objects. Yes.
Glenn, do you want to add something to the
Yes.
Dead Sea Scroll movement?
Yeah.
Well, I'll add a little bit to that,
Please.
Just to expand the discussion a little bit. I also have a question/comment for you, Justin. There is a whole field now of people studying the effects that vibration, travel, changes in temperature, relative humidity, handling have on different materials. And so the research has gotten quite sophisticated now, and there's even research going on at the Getty where they put paintings, different kinds of objects in crates, and they ship them, and they monitor the physical effects of vibration and changes in environment. So our knowledge as a field of material response to these changes is getting much more sophisticated, and so it's very exciting, the kind of research that's going on now. So there is a lot happening in that way, and I think there are people who could say exactly what would happen if you took the Dead Sea Scrolls and brought it to New York and put it on an exhibition, given different kinds of physical experiences it might have. I have as I said, a question/statement for you. I was really struck in your presentation about materials, the nature of materials, and it came close to something that we are facing now in contemporary art. We've developed the term variable media, and this is for artworks where the artists themselves want the works to change every time they're exhibited. So this might be, for instance, cathode ray tube televisions where the artist says, no, I want you to use whatever new technology is in use at the moment for projecting moving images. Or every time you install this thing, such as the work at the Guggenheim, use a plant that might be native to the city where it's being exhibited. And so what we're doing is building thick documentation about what constitutes this variability through artist interviews, through video documentation. And we're starting to borrow some concepts from you, such as the ship of Theseus, this notion that if you keep changing the planks in a ship and by the end of the voyage, all of the planks are different, is it the same ship? Or you cannot step into the same river twice. And this is really helping us in understanding issues of authenticity, and we're using identity more than authenticity these days to construct an understanding of what the work is and should be, and how it can change or not change according to what the artist says.
Exactly. I mean,
so,
if I may, there are cases where if you didn't get change, people would say, this doesn't look like my work now. It's a little like you'd look at, a person aged 67 who currently looks like a 25-year-old, and you'd say, something's gone wrong here. I mean, the idea that, so to speak, every single crack should be filled, or that you should ideally create an environment in which no change ever took place. Well, conceivably, an artist will come along and say, yes, that's what I really want for my work. But in the case of the majority of other works, I actually think that, so to speak, you're not looking, if I was a maker of art, I would think of it as something which I expected to have a life history, but not to be aiming at eternality.
Well, I think because we have limited time, I'm going to open up questions to the audience now. So, do we have any questions for our speakers? Yes, Itai?
Thank you very much. I have one question, and it comes out of what Amir said. You said something like, we're getting better, we're getting there. And I wonder, when conserving active matter, what is the further we're getting to? Because by definition, when you make something that is active, any moment after it is made, it by definition needs conservation, because it's not the whole moment in which it is made, right? While, let's say, conserving matter that is not so active, let's say a painting, right, you're getting to the point of display, or let's say the durability is longer. So I wonder, what is that there that we're getting to when we're conserving something that is by definition, after its moment of making, is by definition needs conservation?
Okay, so when I say we are getting there, I was referring to understanding the material itself. So material as what is going on. Of course, I mean, this comment is great, and I think I'm not probably the right person to discuss it in this specific audience, and I think also others of my panelists here could comment on your question. When I think of role of material scientists in this wonderful setting here that we have, I think we are getting better in providing a solid understanding of what is going on at the scales and dimensions that are important to make solid decisions when it comes to conservation. So the nanoscale that I was presenting today on collagen are the researchers published in Nature Communication 2 years ago. Means that we had no idea what collagen was doing at the nanoscale during a cycle of humidity from 10 to 90%. And this is what I wanted to say, that we are getting there, at least to answer this simple question that is incredibly important when it comes to making a decision of traveling Dead Sea Scrolls from Jerusalem to New York. Again, when it comes to conservation, I think you can definitely address this question better.
All right. Maybe we should just open it up.
Sure.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much. But also, the conversation struck me as a little 20th century. And so I want to push us into the 21st century a little bit, by which I mean, let's not have the conversation be about how to use new materials to keep old stuff around. Okay. Let's imagine, using the material science as the inspiration, that we're going to live in a world where all the stuff around us is active, is doing things independently of us because it's programmed to do them, whether it's filters made of organic materials that respond to relative humidity, all sorts of stuff like that. We can kind of close our eyes and imagine that sort of a place, okay? And now to come sort of to Justin's question, and to imagine human beings as a kind of material, independent of the question of the ghost in the machine, right? We're also meant to change, just the point you made. A 75-year-old looking like a 20-year-old would appear weird, right? So we're supposed to change, and in fact, even with the sort of Silicon Valley fascination with eternal life, cells are going to die, right? And the person will eventually die as a result, okay? That's part of our activity as matter. So if we swing back to the cultural heritage question, right? Thinking about the world of the material sciences of the 21st century, and bearing in mind humans as an active matter that dies, okay? Let's imagine art or cultural heritage that's meant to die, right? So what is conservation going to be then? And here, I'm wondering if we can learn from the human problem, right? That in a way, how are human beings conserved? Not really. We might think doctors are the conservators. They keep us alive. That's the same model. But all humans die. So the real conservator of the human being is the historian, because the life course of the human leads to cellular death, but then there's something else that is kept going for the rest of us. So is the future of conservation in the world of active matter a kind of merging of the conservator and the historian?
Just a point, I do think conservators already act in this kind of history-making activity through the documentation process. We already understand that the object is changing, and every interaction that we do changes it just that much more. And so through documentation, we're creating this kind of proxy surrogate body, in essence being a historian for it. So I already think we're engaging in conservation in history that way. I know that about it.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and that's where my mind was going as well, the sort of archival turn in conservation, which certainly started in the 20th century. But in response to what I might call active matter or variable art, that we're realizing that we need to capture various iterations of work as they change over time. For instance, an installation with different televisions every time you install it. Well, to really know that work, we need to know it through all of its iterations. So we need to know it through the archive as well as its any kind of current incarnation of the work. So I think there is a merging of in current practice of keeping the object alive, allowing it to change, managing its change, deliberately changing it if that's what the artist wants, and thick documentation to allow people in the future to know what the work has been, what it is now, and what it can be in the future.
Deborah?
Yeah, I mean, this is really fascinating and wonderful. It's hard to sit through a discussion like this without thinking of Leonardo, which I'm sure has been on people's minds. And the idea that a really important part of conservation is, of course, maintaining value or creating value. And all these questions of the kind of nature of change and the meaning of change and how to manage it or accept it or resist it are all kind of put to the test when it comes to the question of the market value of something. And I think that's also behind the question of the Dead Sea Scrolls also, because they obviously have incredible historic value, but that's all been documented. If the Dead Sea Scrolls were all transported to New York and the plane was blown up, it wouldn't really matter because we know what they say. So in a sense, the meaning of this, I just think you can't ignore the market, that's all.
Right. No, I don't know. Can I take this one?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not speaking as an authority. No authority at all. But I must say, I am very struck by a partial parallel with the life cycle of a human being, and the thought, you can get to a stage where, so to speak, the animal body is being kept going, but the sense of the value of the life is no longer quite so strong. There's also the question, what would it be like to live in a world where, so to speak, you never let anything go to the dump? You literally hoarded everything that counted as art, for example. But how about if you hoarded everything that counted as furniture? I mean, at a certain level, there'd come a time where this would have a terrible effect upon the, so to speak, the economy of the production of art. Like people talked of, the burden of the old classical heritage. There would be another problem, which is simply that, you've got these museums which were crazily full of stuff that happened to be, 300 years of accumulation, and none of it could be allowed ever to go. You wonder if this might not have we're not at that point where people say we've reached saturation, but there might be a point where one said, hang on, sometimes they should be let to die, or sometimes if you were a maker of art, you would say, well, look, there's going to come a time where I just don't think this should be kept on a life support system. I think we're on the same page.
Yeah, I would a little bit follow up on this 21st century aspects and material science contribution, and I definitely agree that the knowledge about an object is something that is important, and it's once we know it quite well, I mean, it can be in somehow, destinated to damp. But the fact is that I think, and this is a exciting time for material scientists, and especially in this group here, is to think about ancient remains as a source of inspiration to design new things. Learn from these ancient technologies and put them into the framework not of ancient static and destined to die, but as a playground to invent new things and use that human experience as a valid, path to optimize something in a very strict material perspective vision. But this I think is a great opportunity for all of us to move forward and again document something through a scientist perspective, a material science perspective, and use that knowledge to then build the future. I can just talk about Roman concrete right now, and it's something that is useless if reproposed exactly with the recipe that we have, we know, and even is written, Vitruvius wrote clearly what we need to put, and many other scholars and historians and engineers of that time. But the fact is that that specific solution is not at all applicable in the future dimension. But dissect that solution and extract the properties and functionalities that we might be interested in the future, and then repropose it in the new 21st century solutions is an exciting dimension, and of course then if we can integrate new things and combine all that knowledge and design solutions, I think is a way to go. And I definitely agree with you that this is an exciting time for all of us.
Idea that the evidence is in the object itself. That if we're talking about Nam June Paik in particular, we can imagine a time period, maybe 1,000 years from now, maybe even sooner than that, where the narrative sequence that went into the construction of that work of art is entirely lost. Maybe we know the name Nam June Paik, maybe we don't. But by looking at the material remains and using the skills of the material scientists to be able to characterize the physical remains, we can perhaps recreate some of that narrative by taking a look at what is the kind of underlying technology that is inherent to that work of art. Is that, at what point, and I find this kind of conversation about contemporary art really very intriguing, because we're engaged in a dialogue with the recent memory of a particular artist and keeping their intent alive. But when does that kind of distance happen, where we no longer are engaged with that particular artist, but then it just goes back to the material itself?
I think it's easier to talk about that with, say, the Russian constructivists and cellulose nitrate, which is really about materiality and changing materiality. I think in the future, people will be able to research that material and learn about it. I think with Paik, or at least with an artist who creates variable work, the work is going to change and change and change again. So whatever its present incarnation may have very little physically to do with its original incarnation. So I think the answer has to be in the archive with variable works, that to understand what this work is, you're just going to have to go back to interviews with the artists, documentation of its iterations, because the present materiality may not have anything to do with the original materiality, aside from that chain of decision-making that caretakers have made. And so there may be a link there. I find this fascinating, and I'm so interested in this whole idea of smart programmable materials and how this is going to impact conservation. And as I said in my presentation, I'm also really interested in how conservation approaches are going to impact maybe material science research, maybe even philosophy. I'm hoping, I really am sincere that I'm hoping that this Cultures and Conservation project, and particularly with active matter, will be able to tease out models for the ways in which conservation research can impact thinking and research in other fields.
Aaron.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, Alicia, but what we're talking about now is archaeology, right? Now we're talking about the reconstruction of meaning based on material evidence in the absence of an archive of intentionality. And there's a discipline that has developed techniques for doing just that. So, I mean, in a way, anticipating the future, is the question, what do we need to give the archaeologists of the future so
That's exactly my point.
so they could do their work? I mean, I think there's across the panelists, there's this kind of tension between whether active means change or whether it means intentional change. This question of the question of identity over time is what relation is it to an agent that is causing change, and where in the kind of scale across the presentations does that agency live? I mean, I think that's one of the big questions animating this whole project, and your conversations have just sort of brought that out really.
I would love to hear you respond to this in terms of agency. In contemporary art, I often think that the artists themselves sort of imbue the object with a certain agency. But in working with materials from indigenous cultures, there's a whole other way to think about agency invested in the material and how conservators approach that and process that. I'd be interested to hear from you.
Well, I can't say I'm not an authority on indigenous materials whatsoever. I'm an archaeologist, and I can talk about the ancient past and how we can look at these objects to tell a story without having written documentation about them, and looking through the materials that are being used as through the technology that they were used to create them. I think that the interesting debate we have going on here, and I think Aaron highlighted this really well, is this issue of scale and what kind of scale we're looking at objects at whether it's the nanoscale or whether the scholars whose work you're studying, the scale that they're looking at objects and how they saw them. I mean, how now, as well as now, how Admir is interpreting things on the nanoscale, as well as you relying on the written documentation that you have to understand these life histories. I think that's fascinating. I think that certainly our conversation over the next day, I think, will illuminate that more. And so I guess one other thing, though, I do want to add that we didn't talk about today was how research in the conservation of indigenous materials might have to offer to other disciplines. And I don't feel like I can speak towards that, but I think probably someone in the audience can if they just want to add that, add a thought to that before we kind of conclude here.
There's also one question.
What do you
Yes.
mean actually by research into indigenous material?
Well, I guess whether a conservator who's working with indigenous communities and taking care of indigenous, contemporary, ethnographic indigenous objects, their experience in that, or an indigenous perspective as well, and how they view those objects, and want that, of course, incorporated into the care of those objects.
Right. So I'm at the Museum of the American Indian, and I'm going to talk tomorrow about this very thing, but I think this idea of what is our comfort level, what is our relationship with change, I think is a really important thing to explore. Because within the parameters of documentation and conservation, things are constantly changing, but we are dictating that change. We are controlling that change. So when you're working with indigenous populations who has authority over change, I think is something important to examine.
Definitely. Well, I hope we can continue this conversation informally over drinks and snacks outside. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And hopefully you'll come back tomorrow. Thanks.